All right, everyone. Welcome to our third session focused on competency-based education at EKU. We are very pleased to have you join us. A note that the session will be recorded and available as part of our ongoing efforts to design materials to support faculty in the design of CBE courses moving forward. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Matt Connell, who will be presenting our session today and focusing on navigating the frameworks of CBE. Thanks so much, Matt, and to your colleagues in the IDC for designing the session and supporting these efforts. So over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rusty. Good morning, all. For those that don't know me, my name is Matt Connell, and I'm the director of the IDC here at EKU. Big thanks to FCT&L for hosting the series. I do have my colleagues Ann Eason and Mary Adams with us today. They're monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, please go ahead and put those in chat. We certainly will have time at the end. We'll have probably quite a bit of time to talk about some of these concepts in a little more detail. This is our third session on competency-based education, how we think about competency-based education and best practices across the board, but particularly how we could do this here at EKU. So this is a little bit shorter presentation, but I do want to leave some time at the end for questions or follow-up and to kind of dive deeper into some of the frameworks. Much of the different frameworks that we're going to touch on are a little bit higher level, and they really question kind of traditional educational practices. As we think about what traditional educational practices are, we think of those as a face-to-face or a synchronous instruction. I go into a classroom, I lecture, I have assessments, really that traditional mindset as we think of education. Of course, we have asynchronous as well, which certainly over the last 25 years has really exploded, where we have a number of materials in a learning management system, Blackboard for a long time, now Canvas, where students interact with the content, maybe interact with you through some messaging, could be completely asynchronous, and then assignments are submitted and scored appropriately. And we think about that as an A, B, C, D, F type rating system. And CBE is really this third model of, or third modality, if you will, on delivering instruction. And we're going to talk about some of those high-level frameworks here today. So we've broken this into really four families or framework families, and we'll talk about what each of those are. We'll talk about some of the architecture and some possible architectural structures for programs with CBE. There is a huge assessment component, of course, because we have the delivery of instruction, we have that instruction, and then we have how do we assess or understand, or how do we have students demonstrate what they understand in the classroom. And we'll talk about some of those hurdles as well. I do want to put a little disclaimer in here that the traditional model of CBE, or what is CBE as a whole, really is not practical at any institution because of the federal requirements at this point. We still have to follow financial aid regulations, state regulations, those types of things. So we are kind of modifying some things along the way to make sure that we do stay in compliance in a regulatory manner through all of those different entities. So what problem are we solving? We certainly see that we have traditional asynchronous or synchronous instruction, and CBE often fails through other institutions because it's sometimes treated as just a curriculum change. Well, we're just going to change how we deliver the curriculum. And while curriculum change is part of CBE, we have to talk about the whole package of what CBE is. And in this case, we would have to look at things like financial aid, registrar policies, design of the courses, all of those types of things. And certainly some of those are in our control, but some of them are not. We want to make sure that we're staying compliant with our accreditors, certainly the Department of Education through financial aid and all of that. So we think of CBE as really another modality because it isn't just a curriculum change, it's a whole package or a whole program change or alteration. We're not advocating, or I'm not advocating, that you throw away what you currently have. We're saying this is a supplemental or option to what you currently have in your programs, should you choose to do this. So, why do some of these frameworks matter? Why does this matter? Is we want to look at curriculum design. How do we deliver that instruction versus how do we also assess as well? So those are the two main pillars that these frameworks fall under as well. Certainly, as I mentioned, we want to make sure we're staying compliant with accreditation and compliance versus how do we operate, how do we deal with some of these larger questions that might be outside of the classroom. The goal through all of this, of course, is to prevent misalignment. We want to make sure that we're providing students with a system that is effective, that helps demonstrate that competency or that knowledge, which we do with all courses. But again, it looks very different when we talk about it in the framework of CBE. And as we talk about framing out CBE across a particular program, this is the connective tissue, if you will, that ensures a student's hard work or the student's work in a course is recognized, but then it's also scalable across an entire program. So to kind of align this or kind of make some references to what we currently do, in a current program, you may have, and I'm making this up, but let's say 10 courses across the particular program. In theory, all of those courses align. The program level learning outcomes are aligned across the board. Again, we want to continue that. It's underneath that, how do we determine what is met or isn't met through the lens of CBE? And I have some examples or some ideas about that as we move forward. So CBE as a whole, competency-driven curriculum design. So instead of just giving a student an assessment, a multiple choice quiz, they received 70%, they passed it, they moved on. Now we're redesigning the thought of a curriculum under kind of a measurable competency level. So you have your program level learning outcomes, which would be aligned to a measurable competency. And then under that competency, you may have some instruction, some materials, projects, assessments. Does all of that meet that competency, which would then in turn, of course, meet the program level learning outcome. CBE is formed around mastery-based achievement. And I'm going to talk in a lot more detail here in the next couple slides about what that means. But the program is based on the demonstration of mastery rather than time in a course. It is, theoretically speaking, you could have a student in a 3-credit-hour course spend 45 minutes and meet mastery and move on. Not all, I mean, I would say it isn't likely, but it could be if they have some prior knowledge or prior experience in that particular content field. It is also completely conceivable that a student could spend 60, 70, 80 hours in that exact same course doing the exact same work because they haven't achieved mastery yet. Competency-based education has nothing to do with time or time spent in a course. It is all about the mastery and demonstrating that mastery within this particular course or under these competencies. And it really does lend itself also to a very flexible learning environment. And this can be very challenging sometimes when we think about a traditional 8-week course, or now that we're on 7-week courses and online, where Module 1 is week 1, Module 2 is week 2, and we have all of these set deadlines along the way. And while a traditional asynchronous course flows that way, CBE does not. Students may spend 3 weeks in Module 1, but maybe only spend 2 days in Module 2 and maybe 2 hours in module 3 because they have that prior knowledge, and under those competencies they already excel. They've mastered those. But in that first set of competencies, in that first module, maybe they struggle or they haven't demonstrated mastery yet. So it's very flexible in how a student is going to progress through a CBE course. And every student is going to be very different. When we talk about differentiated instruction and we talk about meeting the students where they're at, this really speaks to that model and that philosophy. So we break these down more broadly into four families. When we talk about the learning design or the architecture and the mapping out of the program, that's going to be a much broader conversation. Something you want to start with is, we have our program level learning outcomes. What are the competencies that align to that? What is the path that a student should go through or could go through? That's very important to identify first before the rest of these frameworks come into play. Excuse me. We then have to look at the assessments, the evidence. How are the students mastering that knowledge, those competencies that you or the department have determined this activity assessment demonstrates mastery? What does that look like, that assessment piece? We then take it a little bit further and we talk about the transparency with students. What equals that 3 credit hours? What equals that credential? If it's just a credentialing program, I don't mean it just as a credentialing, but if it's not a degree, but a credentialed program, what does that look like? What is the value for the student? Because we also know that from a marketing perspective, CBE can be really attractive to folks that are coming back, that adult learner that may not need an entire bachelor's degree or master's degree, or even at the 2-year sector. They may just want a specific certification or credential in your field. Well, how do we get that to them at the best way possible? Someone who may have been in your particular field for 20 years probably doesn't need your field 101. They probably have those skills. So how do they demonstrate those quickly, demonstrate mastery, and move on to the more nuanced or higher level concepts within your programs? So this is a big one that I don't think we've talked about a lot at the university, and I hope that this conversation will take off, because anyone can take an online course, and I say anyone in quotes, but someone could take an online program very easily, and that program is going to be the same for someone coming out of high school who's a young adult starting out in their career versus someone who's going into that same field later in life, or maybe has been in that field for 20 years, but now wants to come back and get a credential. In an asynchronous course, those two individuals are going to be on the same path. But from a knowledge and mastery gap, that is going to be a huge difference. That new student, I'm being general here, of course, that new student probably is not going to have the same level of knowledge as someone who has been in your discipline or field for a long time. So I think that CBE is really beneficial to help that level of learner. In another program that we already have this designed with in education, it's really designed for folks who are already working professionals. Well, I don't want to make any statements about who or what. I would generally recommend this to be for working adults that want to come back and tool up. I think a traditional student might find CBE more challenging because to a student, it may feel less structured. It may, again, depending on how that is designed. And then the other piece that needs to be talked about really at the university level is the compliance piece of all of this. We still have to follow federal financial aid rules. We still have to follow accreditation standards, all of those types of things. So how do we fit all of that into traditional CBE? And that's why I gave that disclaimer at the beginning of the presentation, is that we still need to follow all of those pacing and compliance, or that the compliance mechanisms, even though if you think about CBE, it doesn't really fit into that mold. We're kind of having to adjust a little bit to both offer CBE in as legitimate a way as possible, but still maintaining compliance through the regulatory process. So those are really the four main families of framework that we talk about at a much higher level when we talk about CBE. The first two, of course, very impactful in the classroom. Faculty are really driving this, particularly the assessment piece. The credentialing and the regulatory piece, certainly faculty are involved in, but that also needs to be a university discussion because of all the components involved therein. So learning design, that high level, what are those high level abilities that you want the students to know at the end of the program? Those program level learning outcomes. If I'm going into a program and I'm new to the program and I'm taking it face to face, or I'm taking it in an online asynchronous environment, there's a set of outcomes, competencies. Those should be exactly the same in a CBE environment. The path to get to those may change, but we want to make sure we know at the end a student who graduates in this program has these level of competencies. We're going to put a pin in that because then it becomes more granular. Now we have, what are those competencies that can be demonstrated? What are those competencies that align with those program level outcomes? I come in a field, instructional design education. There are credentialing organizations that have sets of standards. I think of IFSTPE standards. It's a long term, but there are 14 in the instructional design field. Those are domain areas. There's 4 groupings where we can identify skills or competencies to meet each one of those, as an example. And this is very program and discipline specific. So I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes because it would be we would rely on you to tell us what those competency areas are, but we're going to group all of those skills under certain domains or competencies. Then we can start to look at the course level, or now even the module level, if you want to compare it to an asynchronous course. What are we delivering in terms of instruction to support those domains and those competencies, which then, of course, support the program level learning outcomes. So at the course level, we need to be very specific, actionable, measurable items to meet those competencies. And maybe there could be a menu of options. We have done that in some of the current CBE courses, where depending on where the student falls, may have more or less items, activities, materials to support that. So again, depending on their level, or it could be laid out as, here is everything you need to do to meet that competency. That's an option as well. And then we then have to look at the performance criteria. How do we measure that success? And this is very faculty driven and program driven. Sometimes depending on your discipline, it could be a regulatory thing as well. Again, that's really a discussion for later on, but now how do we measure all of that? And this is where I'm going to push faculty a little bit to think differently about traditional grading, traditional assessment piece. When we think about CBE, mastery is very much a binary decision. They've mastered it or they have not mastered it. There really is no middle ground. Now, mastered doesn't mean 100% either. Mastery is how you define, the faculty, or in some cases the program, would define mastery. For example, in the IDC, we use mastery in QM at an 85% level. So if you're doing a QM review with our team, we look at 85% mastery. That's how QM actually has defined mastery. I put in here as an example, it's 80%. Maybe 80% mastery, or maybe 80% positive mastery is considered met mastery for your discipline. Excuse me for one moment. Possibly some programs may define this differently. Maybe it's 70%, maybe it's 100%, maybe that would be challenging, but maybe there could be different levels that you want to that you want to focus on. And again, that's a program faculty decision. So the student has either mastered it or they haven't. And if they haven't, we'll talk about what that looks like here, I think, on the next slide. So we give them the information. Is it proficient or mastery? And then is there advanced work beyond that? And that's again a decision at the program level. So what evidence counts as mastery? That really is going to be up to the faculty and up to the program. So things to think about when we're talking about assessment is, does this assessment actually meet the competency? And I know my instructional design colleagues will agree with this. We sometimes see assessments or activities that really don't have a lot to do with what you're teaching in that particular week. There just seems to be a disconnect. And I always give this example. It's very rudimentary, but you may have a student learning outcome and even a module level outcome that says discuss XYZ, but there's nowhere in the assessments that have anything to do with discuss. It's a multiple choice quiz. A multiple choice quiz is not a discussion. So those are out of line. Now that's a very, very basic level, and we could certainly get more advanced there. But is what you're assessing actually measuring the competency? And that's, of course, something you have to look at very closely. We then talk about reliability within that assessment. If you have two faculty equally credentialed, same history, all of that, and you give an assessment to a student, would those two faculties score the assessment the same way? And what is that margin of error? Again, that's a discussion that has to happen at the local level. And typically, if we're talking about almost that binary assessment, hey, this is multiple choice, it is or it isn't, that type of assessment is that's much lower level. We don't need to talk about that, or we wouldn't want to talk about that here. We're talking about here is an assessment that is based on something. Maybe they're demonstrating their knowledge, presentation, whatever that might be. Is our two faculty in that department, again, all things equal, going to rate the student in a similar manner? If not, what is that margin of error that is acceptable and what isn't acceptable? Again, local level decision. Then we also have to talk about that transparency piece, which is equally important. What does good look like? And I put good in quotes because that could be mastery, that could be proficient, whatever word we want to use. What exactly does the student need to do to hit that mastery? Are there examples? I always highly encourage examples of what mastery work and non-mastery work look like. Again, I tell my team this all the time, perception is reality. If the student perceives that what they're turning in is mastery, but it really isn't, how does that learning occur? And that's, I think, where this next slide really comes in, is we also talk about the not yet philosophy. And again, this is going to challenge some faculty, I think, as well. And I want to really push in on these things because, again, mastery, CBE is binary. It's if they've met mastery or they haven't met mastery. If they haven't met mastery, how do we get that student to meet mastery? What do we need to keep doing? In traditional education, face-to-face, online, however you define that, I may take a test, I may get 100%, great, move on to the next one. I may take a test, I got a 70, I need to study harder for the third test. Take the third test, I fail it, but the teacher is going to give me a redo. Final test, I ace it, whatever that might look like. That may be a traditional grade. It levels out, I get a B in the course, something along those lines. Well, that may have worked for the exams that I got 100 on, or we'll say 90 on. I mastered that. But what about that test that I failed, that I retook, maybe got a 60 on, or the third test that I got a 70 on? Is that mastery? If it isn't mastery, how do I get to mastery? It isn't just accept the grade and move on. There needs to be some back and forth with that student to say, here's what you have to do to meet mastery. Let's revise that assignment. Let's rework. If it's a writing assignment, how do we rework it? How do we add some more content? How do we build that out? What do you mean when you talk about X, Y, and Z? Or can you give me a real world example of what you're referring to in this assignment? Again, whatever that looks like in your discipline. So if they haven't met it, how do they revise and continue to revise until they have actually met mastery? Again, as the subject matter expert, faculty are determining what that mastery means, but we want to make sure we get all students to mastery. At the end of the day, at this point, and again, this goes back to that regulatory disclaimer I made earlier, we still have an A, B, C, D, F grading system. I hope that that can change for CBE down the road, but that is not the case at this moment. So how do we fit that into a letter grade? And again, I would defer to faculty on how you want to do that. But if you think about CBE, if they've met it, could be an A. If they didn't meet it, probably not an A. So at this point, that's a challenge. But I always encourage faculty to go back. How do we get those students to revise whatever it is they're doing to ensure they're meeting mastery? Again, it's not about the grade, it's about the student achieving the knowledge that they need, because that program level learning outcome at the end says they're going to do X, they're going to have XYZ knowledge when they finish. So how do we get that all the way through? Now, I also want to acknowledge that multiple attempts should be structured. They should be very focused, not necessarily just keep revising. Just turn it in again. You'll be fine. Turn it in again. Well, that's not substantive quality feedback. Hey, when you turn in your next revision, make sure you focus on this topic, and in this section, you need to build this out for whatever reason. By the way, section 3 looks great. Don't make any revisions. That's more substantive, direct, structured feedback than just saying, hey, turn it in again, take another shot in the dark. Because if a student didn't meet mastery early on, again, perception's reality. If they perceive they did it well, they just turn the same thing back in again. So it's just not going to be well again. So how do we give that structured feedback individually to each student? Faculty roles in CBE, and this is, I think, kind of a refresher of some other slides that we've seen before or other presentations, but you are the subject matter expert. You're defining and designing what those competencies are. And it's really a broader question than that. We want to look at the program level learning outcomes. What are each of the course SLOs, student learning outcomes? How are we going to define all of that across the program? Is it going to be individual to faculty? I generally recommend a programmatic approach to this, again, for consistency. Faculty are also the assessor, the evaluator, the grader of that evidence. Again, because you know your subject matter, you have to take an objective look at, yes, they met mastery, or no, they didn't. And then also think about that reliability test or validity test. If I had two faculty in your program look at the same thing, what do you think? Are you going to align on that call? And if not, what is the acceptable discrepancy there? Maybe there is, or maybe there isn't. And then what I think is most important, and I think under talked about, if you will, in CBE, is that you are the facilitator of this student journey. CBE is a student journey more than just, hey, I'm taking a class for 3 credit hours in this 7 weeks. I'm going to take a class in this 7 weeks. CBE is, as I've said many times, it's a programmatic approach across the board. So you want to facilitate those students all the way through, because ultimately the goal is not a single CBE course. The goal is finishing a CBE program where they meet those program level learning outcomes at the end. And a faculty probably will not teach every course in a CBE package, but they may teach more than one. So how do you facilitate that student across all of those courses? What's that handoff look like between all of that? And we've talked about this in other presentations as I wrap up, and we go to questions here in a moment. I am a huge proponent of CBE. If you can't tell by now, I think it's wonderful. But it is not a sit and forget model. That that differentiation of instruction, that going back and that revising is very, very important. That communication with students is very, very important. And it requires a very high level of faculty involvement tailored to each of those students. It may not be the right fit for every learner or faculty for that matter. And as I mentioned earlier, while I don't want to necessarily dictate what program or what type of student may go into CBE, I generally see it more successful with adult learners or other type of credentialing options versus a traditional high school student comes to EKU as a freshman. That may or may not be the best fit for them. It's going to require a high level of engagement on the student's part too. When you as the faculty give feedback and want to revise an assignment or revise something, the student then needs to come back and pick that up and make those adjustments and have that ongoing dialogue back and forth. So as much as I would love to have every program CBE, I do recognize that it isn't always the best option, much like asynchronous is not always the best option, again, depending on what that program is. So as I wrap up here, we certainly want to welcome questions or discussions. And I will also put a plug in that our team in the IDC is happy to support along the way. I know there's some other conversations at the university level. So I think this will be certainly an ongoing conversation as we move forward. So with that, questions, anything in the chat team? No?
No
Nothing
questions
in
in
there
the chat.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
And for anyone who might have missed it, I put the link to the shared folder that has the slides for the previous two presentations, as well as just some other resources related to CBE for student and faculty perspectives. So that's in there for you.
Are all really quiet. You know, as a former school teacher myself, I've always said that silence is bliss, unless you're a puppy or a toddler, in which case silence is not bliss. Maybe I covered everything really well. We'll see. I do recognize this particular session more than the last two was much higher level. I didn't get into the course level details that I think some of the other ones did, or that we will want to talk about as should your program move forward. But much higher level concepts. It's we want to lay the foundation right the first time. We want to make sure we're doing things in a very structured, thoughtful manner. We don't want to take darts and throw them at the wall. We want to make sure we're really focused on moving this forward, because I think, and I think my colleagues would share this sentiment, that this could be very powerful for Eastern. I think it can be very powerful for certain programs. We want to give the best product that we can to our students across the board, of course, but this is certainly one way to do that. I certainly see a need in the education space for adult learners to come back, to tool up, look for additional credentialing, certifications, those types of things. Again, credentials you probably already offer, or certifications you already offer. I'm not advocating that you create all new programs or certificates. I think, at least initially, let's if you're interested, identify some programs that you could already more easily convert. Your faculty know the content, they know the sequence. That's in my opinion where to start. Again, I'm happy to answer questions. If you want to expand on anything, I'd be happy to do that. And you're welcome to come off mute. I think I don't see a reason not to here.
Matt, quick question. Does the
Sure.
university have any framework on how to compensate faculty? As soon as we bring this to faculty and they start talking, the first question is this part of my load? Is this an overload? How is it going to be structured?
It's a great question. It's a fair question. I have not been in on those conversations yet. I will certainly bring it to Ryan and see what guidance will be provided. I don't want to comment any more than that because I just don't know is the answer to that. But I will certainly find out and get back to you, Tom. Definitely.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep, not a problem.
Once we start moving forward and looking at the intentional designs for EKU, but we'll be working with we'll be working with everyone to ensure that the designs are intentional. So we have several phases. We are in what I'm thinking about as the kind of baseline. We're establishing a baseline understanding for CBE right now, and then we'll move into the design phase where we're really looking at programs and courses that are an ideal fit and a strategic fit for EKU. So it will be an evolution as we move into the next phases.
Absolutely. I will add one piece to that, and this has been a recent conversation. For the immediate future, if you're building a course that will be CBE, it would be treated like a compensated development, like all other courses. I know initially that's the thought, but again, I don't want to speculate long term what that will look like, because that will be a different phase of our rollout.
All right. Are there any other questions for Matt? I'm scanning the Zoom room to see if anybody would like to come off of mute. I'm not seeing anything in the chat at this point. All right. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you.
Well, Matt, with that, I think we've covered the content for today. Again, my appreciation to Matt and to our colleagues in the IDC for the great partnership and establishing kind of that baseline understanding for us at EKU of what CBE is and what it can mean as we're moving forward. Like I mentioned earlier, this session will be archived as part of the resource toolkit, so you will be able to access the video and also the resources as we move forward as well. The next session is focused on the models and examples of competency-based education, and that is scheduled for April 1st. 11:30. So if you have not already registered for that session, I'd certainly encourage you to do so. We'll have some reminders circulated as well. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks to Matt for the very practical and useful and relevant content for us. Thank you, everyone.